Weeping, writes the psalmist, weeping lingers in the evening, but joy comes with the morning. Weeping lingers with the evening, but joy comes with the morning. You know, every good story has a turning point. Every good story has a moment when the drama shifts, the tide turns, and the narrative heads in a new direction. Every good detective story, for example, has that initial stalled and frustrated plot where none of the pieces seem to add up, and the gumshoe detective has all these loose threads of evidence that don't tie together. And then finally comes that moment when out of the blue, the pivotal clue appears, and the dots begin to connect, and the pieces of the puzzle start to fit together. And there's this turning point where the right trail is discovered and justice seems closer at hand. Every good story has a turning point. And I suppose that goes not just for a good story, but also for a good history. History is replete with turning points. In the middle of 1863, as the Civil War waned longer than anybody else ever dreamed, and the Union seemed unable to bring to a finish the effort to abolish slavery and protect the Union, and as the Confederates pressed their forces further and further north into Pennsylvania, the two armies met at Gettysburg, and no one really knew what those 3 days of battle would bring. Maybe just more war, but what they brought, as it turns out, was the turning point, the high watermark of the war, where the tide turned and the Union gained the advantage, and the events to follow seemed to take an inevitable course toward Union victory. Still a long time coming, and many battles still to be fought, won and lost, but the tide had turned at Gettysburg. They had arrived at the turning point. 80 years later, when armies of the Third Reich swarmed across Europe, all seemed lost. No army, no navy, no air force seemed able to stop the advance, and civilization felt as if it hung in the balance. But then came June 6, 1944, and tens of thousands of brave young Allied men stormed the beaches of Normandy and pushed the Nazis back and put them on the run, and the tide had turned. The turning point had occurred, and though there were months still left in the war was still on its way to being over. A dozen years later, when the shadows of Jim Crow laid heavy upon the land and black people suffered under the cruel hand of institutional prejudice, where they couldn't drink from the same water fountains and couldn't sit at the same lunch counters and apply for the same jobs, on December 1st, 1955, in Birmingham, Alabama, a local seamstress boarded a bus and sat in the front row of the rear colored section. A few stops later, when the whites-only section had filled up, the bus driver asked her to give up her seat. Rosa Parks stayed put and refused to move. And people say that was the turning point. That was when the tide began to ebb. That was when the course of history began to change and go in a new direction. And while we have still a long ways to go, the arc of history began to bend toward justice. Every good story, every good history has a turning point. A case can certainly be made that the turning point of human history resides in the story that I just read to you from the New Testament, a story of 3 days. If the Bible is to be believed, it is these 3 days that serve as the turning point of the great story of human civilization. Jesus kept talking throughout his ministry about these 3 days when the Son of Man would suffer under Pontius Pilate, be crucified, dead, and buried, and on the third day rise again. Jesus kept talking and talking and talking about it, and no one really understood what he was talking about. No one really understood what what the story was going to end up at. No one could really pick up on the clues. No one had any idea of this turning point that awaited them. But then come the 3 days, and Luke tells us the story by turning our attention to a group of women who stumble through those 3 days, but they really don't know what is going on. They've loved their Jesus. They loved the rabbi from Galilee. They had hoped that his teaching and signs were going to redeem Israel. But now in these 3 days, the days had grown dark. The rabbi had been arrested. The disciples had fled. The Romans had nailed Jesus to a tree. No pieces seemed to fit. No dots connected. No loose ends tied together. And there were these women all alone at the cross, all alone preparing spices for the dead Jesus, all alone and resting on the Sabbath, and all alone walking to that tomb. They don't really know what they're in the middle of. They don't know that they're in the middle of the turning point. They don't know that the hinge of human history resides on the door of that tomb. They don't know that with the sun's rise, the light of the world will be dawning on the entire human race. They don't know any of this. The only thing they know is that they have a role to play. They have a rabbi to follow. They have a rabbi under whose cross they are to stand. They have a rabbi to lay in a tomb. They have a rabbi to prepare spices and ointment for. And they have a rabbi whose grave they knew they needed to visit. You see, that's one thing about a turning point. You can't have a turning point until you have players. You can't have a story without characters. You can't have a play without actors. You can't have a turning point unless you have what is referred to in the Latin as dramatis personae. That list of characters and actors. You can't have a turning point unless you have a protagonist, unless you have characters who are looking ahead for the turn in the story, who are enacting the turn in the story. You can't have a detective before you can find the clue. You can't have soldiers to storm. You have to have soldiers to storm the beach. You have to have a woman who stays seated on the bus. You have to have a group of women at the cross, at the tomb, preparing spices, walking into the pre-dawn shadows to find a resurrection. You have to have that dramatis personae. You have to have people who are willing to endure the darkness in the hopes of a rising sun. You have to have people who know that weeping will linger for the evening, but that joy will come in the morning. You see, the joy that the Spirit has to give, the fruit of joy, is a gift that comes with hope. It is a gift that comes with the belief that somewhere ahead is still the turning point. We do what we have to do right now because there will be joy in the morning. Which makes those 3 days in Palestine the turning point for you and me. Because to embrace those days, to believe those days, to calibrate our lives around those days, is to believe that no matter how poorly we feel, the narrative is going within us and around us, that there is still this God of human history who has the ability to turn the course of time on a dime. And God does turn the course of time on a dime. And often that dime is you and me. You see, that's one of the great joys of living. Knowing that God created you and me for a meaning and a purpose. That we get to be the dramatis personae, the characters in the drama of redemption. And that the great joy of living comes when we know our part. That though there is weeping in the evening, that there will be joy in the morning. You may remember the story of Joseph Dutton, veteran of the Civil War, Union soldier. But the outcome of the war brought him little joy, even though he was on the winning side, for what was to follow was the discovery of his wife's unfaithfulness, their eventual divorce, his descent into depression, and the perils of the bottle. And this shell of a man stumbles around weeping in the evening until he stumbles upon a gracious Roman Catholic community who take him in, dry him up, and put him back into the drama of life. And with each new day, a yearning grows to wonder, what is the meaning of life all about? And then he starts reading and hearing stories of Father Damien out on the Hawaiian Islands who was ministering to the lepers of Molokai. And that was it. Uninvited, he travels by land and sea to Molokai, and unannounced arrives and says to Father Damien, I'm here to help, and I'm here to stay. And stay he did to care for those lepers for the rest of his days. And late in life, and writing in his journal, Brother Dutton reflects on the drama of his life, the horrible first act and the victorious second. And he writes, did ever one deserve so little and get so much? Every good story has a turning point. Weeping lingers in the evening, but joy comes with the morning. Do you remember Gordon Wilson? Gordon Wilson lived in Belfast. He was a Northern Ireland Protestant, and that's what took him one day, along with his 20-year-old daughter Marie, to a Protestant celebration outside of Belfast to honor the war dead on Veterans Day. In the middle of that celebration, the IRA set off a bomb that buried Gordon and his daughter under 5 feet of broken concrete. The two of them survived the initial blast and could hear and see each other under the rubble, and Marie grabbed her father's hand and said, Daddy, I love you very much. And those were her last words. She slipped into unconsciousness and died a few hours later in the hospital. Weeping lingers in the evening. And when they pulled the sheet over his precious daughter, this good Methodist father had to figure out what was the meaning of life all about. So when he stepped out of the hospital in front of the microphones, when the world expected to hear what they had continued to hear, anger and insults and names and despair and hopelessness, Gordon Wilson said, I've lost my daughter, but I bear no grudge. I shall pray tonight and every night that God will forgive those who kill her. He took his place on the stage and began to live into a turning point, because it was on that day that that grieving father began leading a crusade for Protestant and Catholic reconciliation. He wrote a book about his daughter, spoke against violence, constantly repeated the phrase, love is the bottom line. He met with the IRA, forgave them for what they did, asked them to lay down their arms. History has deemed him a catalyst for peace, one of the causes for the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland. The Republic of Ireland made him a senator, and when he died suddenly in 1995, the Irish Republic, the Northern Ireland, and Great Britain honored this man who had turned the tide. You know, the truth is, life is unfair and life is uncertain. And if we ever needed proof for that, it has come with the year 2020. What a crazy and difficult and tumultuous and uncertain and sickly and deadly and lonely year. All wrapped up into one. And we still have 2.5 months to go. And we've all been affected, and we've all lost something. And we've all wondered, maybe, what is this really supposed to mean? The evening of COVID lingers. And what must I do with my weeping? What must I do as I stumble through the dark shadows of the early morning? When will come the turning point? Who's to know? And yet you can't have a turning point without characters. Weeping lingers for the evening, but joy comes in the morning. And it makes me think of the story of Tony Melendez. Tony Melendez was a Nicaraguan boy who was born with no arms. What's a boy do with no arms? What's a boy with no arms do when he receives the stares of all the other kids? Weep, perhaps, in the evening. Tony's family immigrated to East Los Angeles, and for whatever reason, Tony decided that maybe he could learn to play the guitar with no arms. Maybe he could learn to play the guitar with his feet, and so he began. I don't know how that happens, but Tony learned to play guitar with his feet. He learned how to play the guitar with his feet, and he turned out to be better with his feet than most were with their hands. When the Pope visited Los Angeles, Tony was invited to play for the Pope. And so before a crowd of tens and tens and tens of thousands, Tony took to the stage the dramatis personae and played the guitar. And the visibly moved Pope wrapped his own arms around the boy. Tony writes, after the concert, I walked backstage through the waiting crowd of old friends and new, and I saw a badly deformed young woman in a wheelchair. Her arms and legs were twisted, but she smiled and tried to wave as I passed. Her eyes filled with tears. She reached out her hand toward me and struggled to speak. Tony, she said, because of you, we all have hope. Because of you, we all have hope. And because of those women stumbling in the dark, knocking their shins against the gravestones, because of their part in the play, we all have hope. COVID will not have the last word. There is yet another act to come, and the director is looking for characters for the next scene. Now's the casting call. As shadowed as that first act may be, we still all have a part to play, because this is the good story, and every good story has a turning point. Weeping may linger for the evening, but joy comes with the morning.